Welcome everybody to our first departmental seminar this year. It is the first seminar we do that moved online, so it is exciting to have restarted the seminar series in that COVID secure, safe setting of Zoom. It is a great pleasure to have Amelia Peterson this week as our first speaker in the seminar series. Many of you will know Amelia. Amelia is a fellow, LSE fellow here in the Department of Social Policy. She joined the department in September 2019. Before doing so, she finished her PhD in education policy at the University of Harvard, where she was also a fellow in inequality and social policy. Amelia has a keen interest in education and skills policies. And in particular, she is interested in how political and social factors impact policy implementation. And currently she does work on a book for Harvard University Press, where she develops the notion of a human-centered system design. Today, she will be presenting on social investment policies and specifically on mechanisms of Matthew effects in social investment. Social investment policies have seen great prominence in recent years, but they are a hot potato. They are a hot potato because the questions were raised whether social investment policies flourished at the expense of social protection policies, with possibly negative impact on inequality and poverty. Also, questions were raised, with regards to who benefits from these policies, and this issue is the one Amelia will explore with her paper today, looking at the so-called Matthew effects to see whether those policies disproportionately benefit those who already have something rather than those who need the most. Amelia presents and is happy to receive urgent questions during the presentation if you feel it is necessary, but we will also have plenty of time at the end of the presentation to discuss her paper. If you want to participate in the discussion, a note, the session will be recorded, so you would be recorded too. So we assume that you consent to that when you raise a question. But that's all for me for now, and I shall hand over to Amelia. The floor is yours. Thank you very much, Amelia.
Thank you, Timo. And thank you all for being here online. I was actually meant to do this originally last March. So it's been a really interesting process, kind of revising and rethinking things. A lot has happened in the past 6 months that is quite relevant for the set of ideas I'm talking about. So yeah, I hope this will be a really great opportunity to kind of talk things through with an audience, and I hope that it can be broad enough to interest all of you, but also, you know, with some specific things in there for the education specialist amongst us. It's really great in particular to see some of the students I'll have next term in SP 432, the education policy course. So that's great. Thanks for being here. This is where we're going in the next kind of 30-40 minutes or so. I'll try not to talk for too long so we have a lot of time for discussion. And as Timo says, do jump in. Hopefully I'll see blue hands if you want to ask a question along the way. So this is just a bit of a kind of roadmap of where we're going, and hopefully this will all become clear as we go through. So just to start off with the biggest sort of picture, the place of education within thinking about social policy as a whole. Traditionally, there's been a view that education has a bit of an awkward place within social policy because it's seen as not necessarily a part of the welfare state in the same way as other things we might provide as kind of straightforward public goods. So back in 1975, this is Harold Walensky. And he's justifying his decision not to include education in a book about the welfare state on the grounds that we don't really deliver it as a public good, because its benefits accrue primarily to the able or skilled. In contrast, we now have this contemporary view that education is very much a public good. And this is sort of building on ideas of human capital theory and various models of economic growth, the idea that we all benefit when others are more educated. And from in particular, the idea of skill-biased technological change, the view that some of contemporary inequality can be ascribed to the fact that new technologies have allowed higher skilled workers to become relatively more productive. We get the idea that helping everyone to become skilled to the point where they can work with, as opposed to be replaced by automation, is a way to reduce inequality and to kind of almost provide a new form of social protection. So as Timo was mentioning, although there's this kind of controversy a little bit around the idea of social investment, that a way of providing social protection and social welfare is to educate people, to ensure that people are healthy and able to work. This is a very kind of strong and widespread view now. But from this emphasis on the social investment paradigm, it proposes that more investment in education and kind of more emphasis on educational attainment in general is a policy that benefits everyone. In contrast, those who question this and maybe look back to something more like Walensky's view would say, well, is it perhaps the case that in this kind of social investment paradigm, the rich, who we might define as those who are skilled or those with access to skill development, just get richer, get more skilled, and get more access to skill development, while those who have nothing have no way to develop? This is called the Matthew effect, after a line in the Bible, which is, for whosoever hath, to him shall be given, and he shall have more abundance. But whosoever hath not, from him shall be taken away even what he hath. So this was conceptualized by Robert Merton in the 1950s, coining this notion of the Matthew effect in sociology to represent the more simple idea of just sort of the rich get richer. And he was conceptualizing that through the study of scientists' careers. So noting that early success in a career tends to accumulate and multiply over time to lead to kind of more later advantage. So it's commonly used now just with this idea of the kind of rich get richer sense, but I'll return a little bit later to the second part, that idea of also taking away even what he hath from those who hath not. So the Matthew effect is one way of describing the feeling that there's something questionable about putting sort of too many eggs in the education basket, as it were, and that's something perhaps we need to question about the way that education allocates rewards in society. The other big way that has arisen of questioning that is this kind of crisis around the idea of meritocracy that we're seeing. So this is a questioning of the settlement that has kind of underpinned the translation of education performance into rewards. And from a number of different perspectives now, that's being questioned as sort of somehow broken. We saw this a little bit as well with the notion of a kind of education backlash around from 2016 onwards, a new kind of education cleavage in voting, in the sense that this big difference was appearing between those who have higher education degrees and those who don't, or just more generally, the kind of more educated and less educated. So either in terms of this more specific idea of a crisis around the notion of meritocracy, or just this kind of more general education backlash, there's a lot of questioning of, is education really that much of a public good? So the question I have as a sort of policy scholar is, okay, well, can we somehow influence the balance in the extent to which education is more of a public good, more of a sort of equalizer, something that has multiplier effects, something that does benefit everybody, as opposed to more of a positional good, something that is differentiating between people more, something that is zero sum, in the sense that if somebody's getting something, somebody else can't. And in general, you know, as policymakers, I think it's pretty straightforward. We would sort of want to create systems that are less positional and more towards the public good end. But we still have this concern for creating systems that in some way incentivize people to invest in learning, both in terms of investing their resources and investing their time to study. So thinking about this from a policy perspective, we can focus on the particular policy area of kind of qualification and credential design. So this is a main lever that policymakers have at their disposal to shape people's incentives to study or learn. And qualifications and credentials have different names in different countries, but most of you in your last 2 or 3 years of school, or last 4 or 5 if you're in England, probably studied for a particular kind of qualification, a BAc, a Matura, a school certificate, maybe A-levels. And most countries, and often they're at the kind of state or province level, will have some sort of certificate which is shaping the final years of school, and often multiple options of these certificates. And just to illustrate what kind of choices policymakers have open to us here, we can think about qualifications which are more like a contest. So the sort of Mario race there on the left, where you're competing for some kind of ranking. So the example just below that is from Australia, where you have the option to get this ATAR, the Australian Tertiary Admissions Rank, which places you on a scale of performance up to 99.95. So you can sort of rank all the young people in a cohort in the country and use that for selective decisions. Or we can have qualifications which are more like this kind of treasure chest on the right here from Spiro, something perhaps more like a transcript, and they just say what you've studied, but they don't directly compare you to anyone else. So the example below that is from New Zealand. The NCEA, National Certificate of Educational Achievement, is a certificate and it records all the standards you've met, so all the different kinds of things you've studied, what standards you've achieved, but it's not necessarily oriented towards directly placing you in a ranking to compare you with others. And a lot of other qualifications are somewhere in between, and we can think about all the different kinds of tools by which we might translate the outcomes of one kind of qualification into another. So my interest in qualification design is whether it can help us to resolve this question of how we make education less positional. And one of the ways that people have thought about that is, so traditionally, there's a thinking about qualification structures that they're primarily seen as bad because they're a way of sorting students. So this is particularly so in the United States, where tracking is the process of kind of siphoning students into honors courses or regulars courses, and from there into stratified opportunities for different kinds of diplomas, and then different opportunities for further education and work. In contrast to this, we might have a way of understanding qualifications and qualification pathways, which is more about vocational and occupational specialization. So, and many US writers, particularly looking to places like Germany, see that people there will opt for a vocational qualification, that they will traditionally have higher earnings than those who just get a general school qualification. And the argument then goes that through kind of vocational specialization, you can reduce the positionality of education and have kind of multiple dimensions of competition status and value. So according to this thinking, the response to the kind of crisis of meritocracy and the way to ensure that everybody has a way to benefit from upper secondary education is to invest more in things like youth apprenticeships and technical education, routes to kind of occupational specialization. You can see that argument being made in the Head, Heart and Hand book that came out from David Goodhart in the UK just a couple of months ago. So I had this question about 5 years ago when I was starting to really study this whole area. All right, if it's true that this kind of comparative education logic really works, then as higher education expands, would we see more of those who start to feel kind of left behind, opting for vocational education if that is a strong option? So at this point in time, this was just when sort of T levels, the technical levels, were starting to be proposed in England. I have a sort of parochial interest, obviously, in England, my homeland, and was intrigued to be thinking about, okay, like what's the real viability of these? How can we start to understand the viability of upper secondary vocational education that offers some kind of specialization at a time when higher education is expanding? So we can look at this empirically. This is just looking at the kind of change over time in tertiary education enrollment, so particularly sort of academic tertiary, and then a similar change over time in enrollment in a vocational qualification at the upper secondary level. So if it was the case that as everywhere moved towards expansion of tertiary academic education, everybody flocked away from upper secondary VET, we would see this all moving in one direction. If it was the case that everybody sought this kind of comparative advantage, we would see this flowing in the other direction. As we can see here, we have just kind of a bit of a mixture where we have some contexts, sort of Australia, Denmark, Germany here, where they've had big expansions in academic tertiary enrollment and big declines in the upper secondary vocational. But then we have other places, sort of Canada, Belgium, New Zealand, where they do seem to have had increases in vocational enrollment, even while having kind of smaller declines. And then there's places like Finland, which seems to be a kind of outlier that's had a big increase even in vocational, even while having an increase in university. So I was sort of trying to unpack this and understand, okay, what is then going on with this variation? Does this idea of comparative advantage through specialization work anywhere? How could one understand whether it's working in any of these places? So to do that, just kind of pose this straightforward puzzle. Well, what's explaining the variation we see here? And then designed a study which was to look at 4 different cases which have different trends in terms of whether their upper secondary vocational is expanding or not, and then different starting positions in terms of the kind of the tradition and the quality of the vocational programs there. I can talk more about how I was measuring those. So this was a starting point to try and say, okay, if it's the case that this theory of comparative advantage is working somewhere, it seems to be working in Austria. Essentially, that was the sort of the thinking here, that Austria is somewhere where even though higher education had expanded, there had also been an expansion in the upper secondary vocational. So let's try and understand what was different there from the case of Germany, where the vocational was declining. And likewise, let's understand why New Zealand seems to be this odd case where even though it didn't have much vocational before, that has expanded. And Australia is somewhere where, even though it didn't have much before, that's been more like Germany and has declined. So kind of most similar, most different design, you end up with these pairs of cases. Now I've included this next bit in here because I think it's hopefully interesting for students to be thinking about the kind of things that crop up while one's doing studies. So turned out there was just this big problem with measurement in my key, one of my key variables, which was this notion of the sort of upper secondary vocational share. Those of you who've read some of the varieties of capitalism literature, we have students doing SP 400 at the moment. This is the kind of key indicator in thinking about the difference between systems which are oriented more towards general and specific skills. So I was using, what I thought was sort of this very useful established indicator. The challenging thing is that over time, it's kind of become less useful as a comparator across countries because countries in different ways have been recording sort of overage enrollment. So in a number of countries, and you can see Australia highlighted there at the top, the difference between what it looks like, that upper secondary vocational share, when you're including all age groups versus when you're just including the 15 to 19-year-olds, is really quite substantial, 30 percentage points. That would appear to be a massive change in the trend of young people choosing upper secondary vocational education. But in fact, it's just this kind of very large enrollment of adults in programs that are classified as being at the level of upper secondary vocational education, but are what we would more colloquially think of as kind of adult education. So this is just something that has come about through the changes in qualification frameworks, changes to the way that we have encouraged adults in different contexts to come back into education. But what it means when we're using comparative statistics is that it becomes very difficult to go back far enough in time because different countries at different points started recording age. And so it just means we sort of really lose the ability to compare trends over time neatly. And so for my study, this meant that I had to turn much more to looking at kind of individual country data, treating my cases more on a kind of case-by-case basis, rather than being able to do any straightforward statistical analysis, where I could kind of trust that what these indicators were measuring was actually the same across countries. So I'm happy to talk a bit more about that, but I just wanted to include it in there because I think it's something that applies to a lot of comparative data you might use in time. So this gets then more into some of the kind of descriptive findings about what was actually going on a more case-by-case basis. This is a very kind of compact overview of those findings, and so I won't spend time talking through each of the cases in detail because I've learned with this project that it's just not really possible to do that, but I wanted to put this up here in case people wanted to return to it in questions. In short, though, what we see in each of the cases is a kind of hybridization of academic and vocational education and a loss of vocational specialization. So what vocational means when it's applying to a program label is no longer really something to do with sort of occupational specialization. So we sort of had a decoupling of that label vocational and what I was assuming it to indicate, which was a kind of occupational specialization. And so the whole theory then that young people might choose to develop an occupational specialism as a way to generate their own kind of comparative advantage sort of falls down. That really doesn't seem to be what they're doing. So just to summarize that conclusively, that kind of loss of the specialization and that loss of people pursuing anything that is really kind of occupationally specific means that that logic of specialization just really doesn't seem to be operating. And in particular, when I was looking more into the variation kind of within countries and between the cases, where people are still taking a kind of true vocational program, the variation in that is really explained by different levels of tracking and different kind of changes in tracking across the cases. So it doesn't really seem to be the case that anyone's sort of choosing a vocational program, even in the context where those historically have been very, very strong. It's that they're still in a place where they don't really have another option because of their path through lower secondary. So the whole sort of idea there that this logic of occupational specialization might be a way out of the problem of kind of increased competition, increased meritocracy, of only the sort of already advantaged gaining from education didn't seem to necessarily hold. But all of this kind of investigation into these cases did seem to give rise to a new theory about kind of what was going on with young people's choices. So if a lot of what I've been reading previously had been focused on kind of young people's reasoning in relation to the job market, and they're thinking about, you know, what kind of skills they might need to develop, what way they might need to prepare themselves for kind of different kinds of economies. Once I was actually immersed in the enrollment data about what kind of courses people were taking, in what those courses actually comprised of, and also what people were saying in interviews about the way young people were making their choices, sort of needed a different way of conceptualizing the goals of what's actually going on with these choices. So I conceptualize those goals now in terms of kind of affiliation, so wanting to be part of something that has status, and skill signals, so wanting to signal just a certain kind of level of skill. And then crucially, it seemed that the opportunity to meet those goals differed greatly and seems to kind of be changing in ways that advantage the already advantaged. So that's how it sort of all comes back to this idea of a different kind of set of mechanisms for the Matthew effect. So let's look at how this manifests in some actual cases. So firstly, this point of the kind of changing conditions for affiliation. So this is related to something that's being observed more and more across different countries, increase in school choice. And this manifests in quite different ways in different system structures. In Germany, and to an extent in Austria, it manifests through reduction of kind of formal tracking. So literally just more ability to choose a school type as opposed to being assigned to one. And in Australia and New Zealand, it's through policies which increase the options in terms of different types of schools and some kind of de-zoning. So increasing parents' ability to choose from a larger number of schools. And the consequence of this, and this has also been documented in many other kind of single country studies by others, is sort of more social sorting, and a tendency to move towards schools which have kind of academic pathways. But what I was picking up on in particular was the extent to which this increase in choice that's come about through different means across all the cases is kind of limited and stratified. So the result is that even in countries which have ostensibly sort of very comprehensive systems, like Australia and New Zealand, their systems are actually kind of quasi-tracked. So more advantaged students have choice and they operate that choice and can kind of affiliate with others, and others do not. So let's look at what this looks like in the case of Germany. Germany's interesting, very recent sort of and quite dramatic shift away from the traditional tripartite system of having the kind of Hauptschule, Realschule, and Gymnasium, so sort of three different school types leading to different pathways. And we can see on the left there the whole of Germany, and on the right, just looking at Berlin in particular, the decline of those kind of more lower track schools, the Hauptschule and Realschulen, and being replaced by comprehensive schools in Berlin and also in Hamburg, entirely replaced. And also then a kind of rise there, more movement into the gymnasium, the orange line, the kind of grammar schools. So in the case of the movement into the gymnasium, there's a sort of obvious activation of choice there, people, a shift in terms of where cohorts are located, and some people kind of being able to affiliate to become part of a sort of higher status school type. In the case of the comprehensive schools, it's all a little more complex. This is from one of my interviews, which was with a comprehensive school teacher who was sort of explaining how the school choice operates. Ostensibly, it's meant to be just via allocation, so you can choose where you live, and then by default, that would give your school. In practice, there's also processes whereby schools are limiting choice in the sense that they're, as she says here, so don't accept everyone. So depending both on your ability to move and depending also on your ability to get a school to accept you, your choice would be limited. So this sort of goes back to the idea of, on the one hand, some becoming a lot more advantaged, those who can have access to a gymnasium. On the other hand, those who previously would have been in a kind of specialized school type leading to a specific pathway, now in this kind of quite uncertain game of whether they will be able to have choice somewhere or not. And for those who in the states where they haven't yet moved to the comprehensive schools, we see this pattern of kind of residualization. And again, this has been quite widely studied in Germany and elsewhere, the fact that increases in school choice and kind of increases in people's ability to move between schools, increases in parents' desire to move between schools, leads to what we call residualization, in the sense that the lower status options become increasingly seen as sort of residual, as in just for the kind of leftovers. In Germany, often referred to as like Restschule, so kind of schools for the rest, schools for the ones who are left over, and obviously are not exercising a choice. We can see in the more kind of fully comprehensive systems what this means in terms of consequences for their outcomes. So this is showing over time, sorry, this is a terrible y-axis, but it's showing both the change in the kind of share of enrollment between and a change in the total enrollment, just so you can see the difference between the growth in numbers and the share. And this is between essentially like higher socioeconomic schools. So decile 6 to 10 just means higher socioeconomic, and lower socioeconomic. And all this is showing is literally just the sort of movement away over time from those lower SES schools to the growing high SES schools. But that really, you know, a lot of young people are still left in lower SES schools. So although there has been a little bit of kind of residualization there of people moving away, there's still a great many young people who are left in schools that sort of others have chosen to leave. And in terms of outcomes, for those higher SES schools, the ones that more people have been moving into, we see also that over time, they've kind of increased their advantage over others in terms of the kind of best indicator we had at the current time of whether people were going on to higher education, while the lower status schools have really not improved their position at all. So they've kind of become relatively worse off in terms of their ability to get people onto a next destination, whereas the higher status schools have become more advantaged. Very similar pattern in Australia, so I can talk through this in more detail for those who are interested. Different indicators because of different data availability there. Again, this is showing kind of movement away from, change over time in terms of the composition of the different school types. So the kind of lower status government schools, over time becoming relatively more composed of low-income families, as the high-income families have moved away from those schools towards other options. And then the consequences in outcomes, again, over time, sort of more of an advantage building up in terms of the destinations of people moving on. Just one thing to highlight here is sort of this difference is really reflecting the kind of the differences in the underlying social groupings, even more so than school type. So there's kind of affiliation around particular kinds of schools. If you break this down to sort of particular schools, it's that the disparities in outcomes, as we'd be familiar with from places like England, are really considerable. So while in theory everyone here is following the same kind of qualification pathway, in terms of the way that they're clustered into different schools, at the upper secondary level, they really have massively different chances of actually being able to kind of complete and achieve in that pathway. So just to link this to the next focus on skill signals, one of the things I wanted to highlight is this sort of other implication of detracking that helps to really emphasize why skill signals have become increasingly important. So I mentioned that we've seen even in countries which we've thought of traditionally as highly tracked, a kind of movement away from that. And this is just showing that a consequence of detracking seems to be a kind of increase in a sense of competition for people within their classes. And the way that I interpret this is that in the systems that already have less formal tracking, because young people are not sort of labeled by a general ability level, they have more incentive to differentiate themselves by way of grades or other performance signals. So it's more important for those young people on the left who are in kind of less tracked systems to be differentiating themselves through their grades. And so they have this greater experience of competition. But then it becomes important to consider sort of what sort of performance signals are actually available to them. If they need to be differentiating themselves, what access do they have to the signals to actually do that? And this brings me to this quite different area of thinking about kind of access to skill signals and the way that our policy designs can provide young people with the ability to differentiate themselves in that way, and the way that that's been kind of changing over time. So I'll go through each part of this in turn. So to start off with, what we see across all of the cases in this kind of 20-year time span is that the policy direction in terms of skill signals has been in general an effort to sort of equalize attainment through targets that are set at a particular level. So the main policy thrust has been away from anything that differentiates and towards standards that offer kind of benchmark levels as opposed to anything that differentiates. Much of this implemented, as you could imagine, by kind of progressive left-leaning governments who have been trying to reduce the extent to which schools sort of differentiate between people and place more emphasis on getting everybody up to a kind of universal skill level. But a consequence of that has been that there are fewer signals available to people to differentiate themselves. And so this has led to, that there are fewer signals available to differentiate themselves. So if we recall that I was saying, one of the things that young people really want to do is to be able to signal their skill level. These kind of policy changes reduce their ability to do that, because yes, they can signal whether they've reached one benchmark or not, But if almost everybody in their system is reaching that same benchmark, then it's not really a differentiator at all. So there's a kind of weakening, first and foremost, of the differentiating signals. Running counter to this is a different trend, which has been to kind of centralize a certain set of final exams. So separate from the effort to create kind of single benchmark standards in the exam processes, which mediate the process of selection into higher education, the trend has been towards centralization, creating a stronger signal. So what this means is that for young people who are in those selection processes, they then have access to a stronger, kind of clearer signal of what they can do. Overall, then, what we have is a sort of loss of signal for many, and then stronger signals for some. So for all of those who aren't involved in this kind of very selective exam processes, they have less that they can reach to signal what they can do. The first example at the top here is referring to this kind of case of top notes, which has been a debate in Germany about should one have grades that are more about sort of social skills included on young people's reports when they leave school. Highly controversial because they're very subject to teacher bias. Many reasons why we wouldn't want to advocate for them. But it's interesting they're kind of included as something which the loss of them, the removal of them, which was done for sort of social justice reasons, has made it more difficult for young people who aren't involved in those very particular selective exam processes to have any other means to kind of signal what they can do. On the other hand, then the addition of stronger signals for others, the example here from New Zealand is of this kind of process of the reintroduction of this particular scholarship exam, which was sort of heavily ranked and provides a kind of granular and reliable ranking in a way of people. So for very high achieving students, they have something that they can take on into higher education to employers, which puts them in some sort of ranked position. Whereas for others, they're within the kind of NCEA system I described earlier, which sort of you collect your treasure chest, but it's not really something comparative. So overall, what we seem to see is a sort of increase in competition. So the combined effect of detracking and of people sort of all being within one general school milieu and all being in one general qualification pathway, and then of centralized assessments, which are used to provide kind of more credible and granular indicators of performance, means that overall you've got a larger competition, more people in it, and something which can distinguish fewer winners. So drawing on the theory about kind of competition design and the way that this changes people's motivations, we've got something that is sort of more competitive. And what I would propose is that this is a big driver of why we're seeing this kind of crisis of meritocracy and people being very uncertain about whether that whole sort of system is working, that it seems to be creating too much anxiety, too few winners. I think a lot of this can come back to the sort of qualification design that we've ended up with through these two processes of the sort of detracking and more centralized assessment. I'm going to pause there. I do have some more slides just to talk through the significance. Yeah, if people want to ask more about centralized assessments and sort of how it changes people's calculus, I can, but I'm actually going to skip that and just go to kind of conclusions. So these are sort of, tentative. All of this comes from 4 cases, as well as a little bit of research I've been doing more recently, looking more at England again. But yeah, as I say, sort of tentative conclusions, but it seems that across these quite different cases, despite this sort of reorganization towards more comprehensive systems, despite a lot of policies that were implemented with a strong kind of social justice angle, on one hand, we still have a strata of schools which are serving students who have much lower resources and lower attainment, and they don't have the opportunity to access skill signals. And in some way, we could say that they have even less opportunity than they had before because they no longer have their own sort of qualification pathway. And in addition, through kind of centralization and through this bringing people together into kind of one competition, processes of commensuration, we seem to have a system which is sort of more competitive. And and therefore it provides more opportunity for a very small number of top performers to access sort of the best prizes. And so I think what we have as a result is a particular kind of Matthew effect, which is really benefiting a sort of increasingly small number. And I would relate this to this kind of crisis of meritocracy, because I think the balance has shifted, where it's no longer sort of a general majority that might be benefiting from the structures and the skill signals in our systems, but an increasingly sort of small number. I'll leave up some kind of tentative implications that we can talk about in terms of policy recommendations, but it'd be great to move to questions.
Well, thank you very much, Amelia. A very exciting presentation. I have to say, as a parent of a 7-year-old, it is also a little bit disturbing, because it does echo some of the concerns Bonori has. The floor shall be open to those who have questions or comments. If you do, please raise your hand. There's a raise a hand function available. We would like to have kind of people speaking rather than using the chat box, to have an as normal interactive seminar as possible. The first hand that went up is Azan. I hope I pronounced your name correctly or reasonably well. Please, Azan, you are the first one to ask a question.
No worries, Timo. Thank you very much. And thank you, Amelia, for the talk. That was really interesting, and kind of loads of really interesting points to pick up on there. The kind of, I guess, it's somewhat tangential to the kind of stuff that potentially you've been speaking about, but one of the things that I've been thinking about is, in particular, about how, at least in the United Kingdom, there was this kind of big push to increase university attendance, particularly under Tony Blair government, right? So it's kind of, making sure that you get lots of students into university, right? And one of the things I was thinking about is kind of, to what degree is university attendance itself almost uses this benchmark, whereby kind of everybody needs to get to university, and then in that sense, that has kind of itself weakened the signals that we're talking about. So in terms of those signals of kind of performance, and given that we've got more students going to university, and therefore there's kind of homogeneity across the graduate population, does that have any impact potentially on kind of early youth unemployment with regards to the kind of effects that you're talking about?
Yeah, sure. No, it's a great question. So I think there's two really important things to bring in here. So one is the notion of kind of credential inflation, and to what extent do we believe that inflation is a problem? So that would be describing the perception that as more people hold a particular credential, its value sort of decreases. The way we can get around that is by saying, well, what matters is the kind of actual skills that people are developing. This isn't just a signal, like people are spending 3 or 4 years doing something, so like they must be developing some actual skills, and then those will be recognized in the labor market and rewarded. So it will kind of all be worthwhile. And I think one of the things that we are feeling in higher education is the fact that we need to try and slightly recouple sort of our qualifications and the specific skills that we say we're developing. So this has been part of the shift towards more focus on kind of learning outcomes, on graduate outcomes, sort of thinking more about what is it people are actually learning in degrees, and also towards some of the work that has been done linking up with the longitudinal educational outcomes, linking up sort of people's earnings and what courses they've studied, and really starting to think about the differences between different kinds of specific courses and people's outcomes. But I think we're still some way from being able to be confident that we have credentials that really reflect the skills that people have developed. I think if we could bring those slightly closer together, we could get round some of the kind of problems of inflation. But that will probably bring its own problems, in that we would probably see gaps start to open again, in the way that we're seeing them open with master's education, for example. So I think, by which I mean like gaps by social background. So we're sort of always in this tussle between, wanting to give everybody the same thing and the reality that people want to differentiate themselves. And that's where I sort of come down to, okay, well, we have to find some way to encourage sort of horizontal differentiation, sort of specialization, rather than the kind of vertical stratification. Did that answer your question?
No, definitely it did. No, thank you. That's really helpful. I might have another question later on, but I'll give others the opportunity.
Thanks.
Is there another hand that wishes to go up? Thomas Biegert. Please, Thomas, shoot.
Hello. Thanks, Amelia. Great talk. Very interesting. Maybe, what do we say? More a comment than a question. No, it's a question, or maybe a kind of an invitation to expand a little more on how you believe that theoretically those micro level mechanisms, status signals, the micro Matthew effect, how they kind of play into to doing. Because as far as I know, that literature, this is mostly an explanation to explain cumulative disadvantages or advantages over time. And it seemed to me like you're making an argument that it's basically not only how these signals work for you, but another thing that comes in there and that might increase the kind of accumulative difference even more is that it's also that some people know that these signals will do that for you and some people don't. And, like these are usually the people who have the advantages anyway and might make an extra effort to get to the signal, right? Is that the general argument that you're making?
Yeah, it's definitely part of it, and it's part that I didn't have so much time to go into. But I think there's a really important aspect here, which is about kind of predictability. So our policy impulse has been to try to make our processes of selection more transparent. And that includes our kind of examination and rewarding processes in general. Sort of a well-functioning meritocracy is one in which it's sort of very clear what you have to do to win the rewards. In practice, though, of course, this means that if you have access to a lot of resources, it's easier to game, right? We're used to the idea of people sort of gaming educational processes. And that's at everything from the level of sort of choosing schools that are known to be better at preparing people, using tutors, and also just the way that people prepare for exams. So in the psychometrics literature, there's a big concern about the kind of the growing just like test preparation essentially, and the fact that that's distorting the outcomes. So the extent to which these processes are predictable, I think also is also a source of advantage for more advantage. It makes it easier to convert what resources you have into coming essentially, and that I think is a really difficult one to get around. At the level of psychometrics, we can do it by better test design, more expensive tests which are less predictable, and so I guess that's the kind of only starting point. And then with things like lotteries for school choice or school selection, so essentially removing any points where people having additional information or additional resources would allow them to win a process.
Thomas, the sum went up, so that answer satisfied him. Berkay raised his hand. Please, Berkay.
Hey, Amelia, thank you for the great talk. I'm going to ask a question about the tangential related issue, maybe. Because I was quite surprised with this slide where you show the country's different tendencies. I was wondering, one aspect that drives these vocational schools shares going in a different direction could be the strongly changing selection by gender to these vocational schools across the countries. And we haven't really covered that much because vocational schools are becoming increasingly masculinized rather than feminized in certain countries. So then leaving for girls the only option to go to other types of schools, and then that is leading to certain fields of choices in the higher education. I was wondering whether you could say a few words about that gender dynamics, differential changes in gender composition across the vocational schools versus other schools. That's my question.
Yeah, it's a great one. I wish I could say more. It was a variable that I just sort of couldn't really deal with, because it would have just added a whole nother. It sort of operates differently in different countries, but there is definitely, it's a huge issue, and it's complicated by the fact that depending on what is actually being called vocational, it sort of looks like it's operating very differently. But often then when you get down into the kind of content of occupational specialism, yes, it's very much the case that programs which are what we might call kind of truer vocational programs, in the sense of really offering more occupational specialism and higher wage returns, are very male dominated. So I think it's part of this whole problem of the label of vocational sort of having slipped too much, the kind of conceptual stretching there. It doesn't apply accurately enough anymore to, I think, be able to do really straightforward analyses looking at this for gender. But there's also then the problem of we saw already, or we see in a number of countries, that the benefits of vocational programs tend to accrue to young men and not necessarily to young women. So like if you're in Australia, if I was advising a teenage girl whether she should take the kind of VET units, I would say no. And if I was advising a teenage boy, I would say yes, if I was just going on what information I had available. And that's partly because of discrimination in the labour market, or kind of what kind of subsequent labour market choices young men and women are then able to make. So it's very tricky to say, for the particular issue of gender, sort of how much is this something that we grapple with in the school system versus, how much is this something we grapple with in labour markets, and that actually that gender segregation will be there as long as we have extreme segregation across different occupations. And it's a big concern, I think, for my sort of general feeling that horizontal specialization is a sort of good thing. I feel that a lot less when I'm thinking about the gender issue, because one would have to first get around the gender segregation issue.
There is no hand up, so I may squeeze in if I can. When you talked towards Thomas's question, you mentioned private tutoring, and I kind of penciled down a few things in private tutoring just before that, and I wondered about adding that dimension more explicitly to your case studies. And if my understanding is correct, vertically differentiated higher education systems are more prone to tutoring. So having observed this first in Japan and South Korea, but also in more recent times, if we look at the Sutton Trust, for instance, also quite a pronounced increase in private tutoring here in the UK, and in particular in London. In your 4 case studies, would then Australia be the case with the greatest vertical differentiation, especially if compared to Germany and Austria with the universities of applied sciences? Do you find different dynamics in private tutoring and the use of shadow education across your 4 cases, if you have considered that dimension? And what did you find? That made me curious.
It's certainly something that came up a lot anecdotally, and actually it's just reminded me that it would be great to, because I know there's better data all the time, and so I was sort of checking periodically, occasionally, while I was doing this, there wasn't, for all my 4 cases, good data, but there is all the time, so I should go back and check again. Yeah, it's certainly a growing thing, and it's interesting you mentioned London, because one of the big kind of common sources of variation that came across all the cases was sort of urbanization. So just hugely different patterns of all of this when you're talking to people in cities versus more rural areas. And also some of the difference across Austria and Germany seems to really be explained by the differences in kind of rurality. In fact, I can just put this up. This was one of my extra slides. But the fact that Austria has remained a much more rural country seems to be a really key factor, because the patterns in Vienna versus the rest of Austria just look totally different. Because as you can imagine, all these dynamics of people kind of concentrating in certain schools, and in general, them being able to use things like tutors, like shadow education, all of that is geographically located. So the message across kind of Vienna, Berlin, Hamburg, Sydney, Melbourne, Auckland, was parents and teachers sort of saying almost exactly the same thing in terms of the pressures they were feeling, in terms of what they were valuing, in terms of what young people were trying to do. But then, that was very different from the kind of more rural areas of all those places. So I think tutoring patterns I would expect to be now quite similar in the cities across all of these countries, for young people who are aiming for those more granular centralized assessments, because, as I was mentioning earlier, the fact that they're so predictable and the rewards to having those very, very top marks are so high, means that, yeah, it makes sense that people would be investing wherever they can when the options are open to them.
Well, that's quite interesting, because if you have rather an urban-rural divide than a cross-national one, so are there particular dynamics of competition in these major urban centers? And looking, well, at the extreme case of South Korea, for instance, the one as many know, I'm quite curious about, if even within the city there are concentrations, and the availability of private tutors, good private tutors, is driving house prices. And if one goes into certain neighborhoods at certain times, one can really see the children, young children, with backpacks going from one tutor to another on a Saturday morning, and in between at lunchtime they quickly have a bit of udon, and then they continue with backpacks often bigger than their torso. And if it's interesting that you say Vienna, Berlin, Sydney, there's not really much between them based on your impressions talking to teachers. Very interesting. Thank you. Anybody else with a question? Please raise your hand. Don't be shy. No? Oh, Pankuri? Yes. If somebody raises a hand in the video rather than the electronic hand, make yourself known, because we might not see you in your little window, because not everybody is in gallery view. But Pankuri, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, sorry about that. I couldn't figure out the hand raising, but I was just, so based on, I think, what Professor Ozkan also mentioned about the gender bit in terms of vocational training, and so it's just some schools that I visited. I'm also wondering, it's when we say, I think, vocational training or technical training, we just automatically have a very gender biased view over there, and it automatically becomes maybe more towards males than for females. And I'm just wondering, so I'm not sure if it's a very common term here, but there are studio schools in the UK. And I mean, the one that I visited here, I think that was in Feltham, it did not seem like a very what one may think of when you say vocational. And also because I think they do combine, that's what I was looking up, they do combine traditional academic approach. And do you think something like that is more approachable? It would also be more inviting in terms of all genders versus being gender biased, or just in terms of, by thinking about it, it may like limit some genders?
Yeah, it's a great question, because studio schools are such an interesting example. So I would identify them as one of the new forms of kind of hybridization that we have. So their goal is to try and bring together some academic education and some vocational. But they're also perhaps an example of this sort of loss of real sort of skill specificity and occupational specialization. Because while they have a kind of occupational flavor, young people there aren't necessarily choosing the school on the basis of, yes, I want to become, some of them like airline industry or creative arts, like for the particular industry that they are meant to be developed for. So I think one of the challenges they've had is that they are being kind of held to account for both developing people academically and also for preparing people with some kind of vocational specialism that the young people haven't necessarily chosen the school for, because they're dispersed geographically across the country. And so you're probably just going, if you choose to go to a studio school, you're just going to your local studio school. You're not going there and then being like, right, and I want to develop in the airline industry. So it's a different sort of logic. It's more kind of vocational education as like engagement rather than as actual occupational skill development. But to the extent that vocational education as engagement can be a worthwhile strategy, I would still hope that they manage to kind of get back on their feet and grow over time. But yeah, I think that's been sources of challenge so far.
Good. Thank you.
And Azan is now getting ready for the question he already indicated, second question in his first comment. So Azan, now back to the front of the queue, please.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. I apologize if I'm talking too much. It's just I'm very interested in all of this topic. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. So I guess I have kind of a two-part question. First one is just a sort of factual sort of checking question, but the second one is a little bit longer. So the first one is just, is it generally the case, at least nationally or cross-nationally, whether or not university graduates earn more on average than non-university graduates? And then in relation to that question, I had a question about kind of the sort of class implications or class undertones with regards to the taking of certain qualifications. So is there kind of a sense in which taking vocational courses or qualifications is more the reserve of kind of working class communities, whilst taking academic university subjects is more the reserve of middle class people? And then given that difference, is there a recognition about kind of wage differences? Because it almost seems to me, I might be wrong, but it seems to me that people who take those vocational courses early on seem to earn more than those who are university graduates, but then there's still this sort of class undertone. So if you could just provide any comments on that.
Yeah, sure. Great question. So on the first one, in terms of earnings, like on average, yes, everywhere. Certainly, I don't know of any country where there isn't some kind of average graduate wage premium. So where university graduates on average earn more. In the US and the UK in particularly the US, to an extent the UK, there's a kind of wide enough distribution that some graduates won't earn more than than some non-graduates, and in a number of places, those who hold some kind of specialized technical qualification, which might not be a BA level, but something beyond school, can earn more than a kind of good portion of university graduates. But it isn't anywhere yet the case that on average holders of a lower level technical qualification will earn more than holders of a university qualification, although the difference there is quite small. particularly in some parts of the US, and depending on what the vocational qualification is, if it's in certain industries. The class question is a huge one, and it's kind of troubled the whole study of vocational education, because obviously in all our studies we have to be thinking about okay, what the sort of comparable outcome. So we can't just take a bunch of people who went to university and take a bunch of people who did vocational courses and sort of say that everything about the ones who went to university is because of their education, because we know that there's massive selection effects. You know, you're much more likely to go to university if you come from a more advantaged background. And we know that those background effects sort of carry through. So yeah, I guess all I can say is like it's a huge factor for on the empirical side, just trying to disentangle sort of what is background and what is education. But in terms of making policy, I think it's one of the reasons why we have often just a lot of unintended consequences, or just not great policy making about education that is oriented towards more occupational specialization, because there's such a thin line between education that is oriented towards occupational specialization and a kind of sort of vocational dumping ground, never going to have a good status because it's not perceived as being high status by the kind of middle classes. So this is why Timo mentioned at the beginning, one of my interests is sort of how we disentangle the kind of social aspects of all of this from the kind of policy design aspects. And we obviously can't really separate them. So all we can do is understand a lot more about the social processes when we're making policy.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Lots of really useful insights there. So thank you.
Mary Alice, you had your hand up.
Yes. Hi. That was really interesting. Thanks, Amelia. I just wanted to follow up on something that Azam brought up in his earlier question about tertiary education. And I guess, so like some of what you've said is that some countries are pushing students more into kind of a single stream, I guess, in high school. But I suppose, like, my interpretation of that is that it's kind of a good thing because you've got everyone aiming to achieve at least a high school education, and then the options to do vocational education as part of tertiary studies, like either at a university or at some other institution. So, like, I'm just wondering if you think that that's a useful thing, like that the policy of having everyone achieving high school and then more is a good goal, or do you think that there's issues with that are perhaps not intended?
Yeah, this is sort of like my advisor always used to say to me, he's like, you're sounding dangerously like you're endorsing tracking. Like, and I'm, I'm not, I'm in favor of comprehensive education. And I think just one of the problems that we see arising in systems that are ostensibly comprehensive is that it's very difficult to actually create whole systems of schools where every school is actually offering the opportunity to kind of fully achieve that level of high school education. So this sort of also gets to Thomas's question about the micro level. Some of the things that that happen is, for example, teachers will get 14, 15-year-olds who are 3 or 4 years behind, or who maybe don't have the same first language as the country. And so then they feel, oh, well, we can't, teach these sort of university entry courses with them. We'll have to do something else instead. So systems create these other courses that are the sort of instead, and suddenly you're back with tracking, but it's just in terms of courses rather than between schools. So I think the challenge for comprehensive systems is sort of what is actually involved in getting everybody to move through a single qualification pathway, because in the way that qualification pathways have evolved, something like New Zealand's National Certificate of Educational Achievement, which kind of one qualification, or the senior secondary certificates in Australia, which are also sort of one qualification, like many US diplomas, there are so many different options within them to sort of cater for the fact that when they start the qualification at around 15, there are just wildly different levels in terms of prior preparation. And so it's kind of a bit of a chicken and egg problem. But either we would just have to say, look, like, we're going to have one set of standards for this qualification, like real standards, and we're going to just somehow go hell to leather to get everyone to meet them. But historically, you know, when that's been tried in places like the US with sort of minimum competency testing, it's just led to quite a lot of failure and dropout. So we haven't really got a solution for that problem at the moment to create kind of genuinely comprehensive systems. And that's something that we know starts before school in terms of those gaps. So again, that's a problem for other policy areas, I would say. I think it's not something that can be solved within education.
We are slowly moving towards the end, and also the number of people who drop out increases. So I would like to make a few announcements so that you know what's ahead of us before offering the last words to Amelia. We will be changing our seminar day from next week and move to Tuesday 5 p.m. rather than the 2 p.m. Wednesday slot, which is a very busy one across the school. And we hope by moving to Tuesday at the end of the day that more people will have the opportunity to participate then on our committee-heavy Wednesdays. We have people lined up for the next few weeks, and if you do come back on the 3rd of November, you will have the chance to listen to Shalini Grover. Shalini is an anthropologist here at the LSE in the International Inequalities Institute, and she will be delivering a paper on global care chains and look specifically at the development from the local towards the global with reference to the Indian case. So a very qualitative paper that will be followed by a very quantitative paper the week after, the 10th of November, when we have Vernon Gale from the University of Edinburgh. He's a sociologist and is a professor there also for social statistics. So expect numbers, and he looks at social class inequalities in school GCSE attainment. So those of you who were very intrigued by Amelia's presentation and have an interest in education might find Vernon's paper very interesting too. The last one to announce at this point in time would be then the 17th of November, where we have Yifei Yan. Yifei is also an LSE fellow here in the department, and she will be looking at capacity development in administrations, and here specifically will be presenting a case or 2 case studies of teacher training in India and China. So the next 3 weeks of ISPP seminars lined up, and I do hope many of you will come back, and hope that that Tuesday slot works better for many. But now the concluding words, Amelia, please, if you want to add something, so no pressure.
I guess the only thing I'll add is the sort of more optimistic spin on this, and particularly in relation to that last question, is like whether there is more genuine potential in kind of hybrid models. So like the studio school model suggested earlier, and with a colleague been looking a lot at, there are a lot of examples of those in the States now, places like kind of big picture learning, which combine internships and then sort of more academic study. So I guess that's the other sort of thing that people might just be interested to learn more about, is kind of can more fully hybrid options that allow people to both specialize and also not to sort of step out from the main common pathway that provides access to higher education if they want it. But yeah, those hybrids do exist and are potentially kind of growing and strengthening.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, especially Amelia, for your paper. Maria, who is the angel in the background who organizes all the logistics, just sent me a little chat message saying that, oh no, it's everybody. I see just that if you haven't followed the chat, in the next few days, all the information about the upcoming events will be put onto the departmental website so that you can get more information about the speakers and the papers. And also there, you will have the facility to register for the event so that you can zoom in. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Special one to Amelia. Take care. Enjoy the reading/writing week or marking week, whatever you have to do, and see you hopefully in good numbers in not even a week's time. Take care and winke winke. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye bye.